Now I'd like to call our first panel to the stage and to move on to our key discussion on issues in trade, labor mobility, and cross-border regulations. So my colleague Tim Ross, who's a Brexit reporter here with Bloomberg News, will be leading the discussion. Please, Tim, you and your guests, please take the stage. And you'll be in a discussion with Ambassador Jacqueline Miner, head of the EU delegation to the UK, and Andrew Hood, Senior Director and Barrister-at-Law of Dechert LP. So, Tim, over to you.
Thanks very much, Tom. Hi, everybody. The revolution continues. These were the words of Nigel Farage to me earlier on today, reflecting on what we all know he was reflecting on. But I think it would be useful just to have a think about exactly what that revolution might look like. And we've got with us two excellent people to tell us a little bit about how that might affect Brexit, among other issues. Will, for example, Theresa May's government now in these uncertain times decide to cling more closely to Europe for security measures, because we don't know what Donald Trump might do, because the world seems a less stable place? Or will she take Donald Trump up on his offer of putting the UK at the head of the queue for a trade deal, after Barack Obama famously said we'd be at the back if we voted for Brexit? There are many, many more questions that arise from Trump, but there are also plenty of questions that arise anyway about exactly what the implications of our Brexit vote will mean for trade and labour mobility, as well as cross-border regulations, which are our themes for today. I'm not going to try and answer any of them because I'm a political pundit and we don't have a great reputation for getting things right at the moment. I, in fact, got everything wrong pretty much before the general election last year. Didn't really see the Brexit vote coming, but by last night I just about learned that the unexpected was possible. Anyway, we're going to hear, first of all, from Jacqueline Miner, who's the EU's ambassador to the UK, and then from Andy Hood, who spent plenty of time working with David Cameron, specialising in legal advice and issues relating to the EU. And then hopefully there'll be a bit of time left for some questions from you guys if you want to get involved, and we'll see what comes up. But first of all, Jacqueline, would you like to say a few words?
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. And thank you for that provoking and provocative introduction. From the perspective of the European Union's institutions, so that's the Commission, the Council, composed of the other 27 member states, and the European Parliament, there are only three things that they have said, really, since Brexit. It's a very narrow script, and they've stuck to it, perhaps surprisingly for commentators. The first is they regret very much the outcome of the referendum. They would have liked it to have been otherwise, but naturally they accept it. And I don't detect, as you apparently do, any belief that there will be a second referendum in Brussels. Certainly the people I speak to in Brussels are convinced that the UK is heading for the exit door. The second point is that there can be no negotiation unless and until the formal procedure laid down in Article 50 of the treaty is triggered. And obviously, diplomats will try and talk to other diplomats, but no formal negotiations, no setting of a mandate by the EU 27, no designation of a negotiator until that withdrawal notice is filed. And it must be filed, as we all know, in accordance with the constitutional requirements of the United Kingdom, and they are proving somewhat tricky to ascertain at present. And the third point is that from the perspective of the institutions, and I think all of the other member states, at least officially, there can be no better relationship with the European Union than being a member of it. And without wishing to punish the UK or to be vindictive, I think the other member states have said very clearly, when it comes to the single market, for example, the four freedoms are indivisible. It's not going to be open to the UK to cherry pick. The Article 50 negotiations essentially lead to what is now referred to as the divorce agreement. How do you untangle the relationship that's been built up over the past 40 years. And that is decided by qualified majority voting. Qualified majority voting in the Council of the remaining 27 member states. So there are no national vetoes on the divorce. There is also the approval of the European Parliament. It's a simple majority vote. Again, it's not an absolute endorsement of everyone in the Parliament. Interestingly, British MEPs can take part in that vote, although the UK will be outside the discussions in the Council on withdrawal. Far more importantly, I think, is what the future relationship will be. And that's not really going to be covered by Article 50, although it has to be compassed by it. It has to be, the Article 50, the withdrawal agreement, has to take account of the future relationship. And whatever that future relationship is, and it might be a return to WTO rules, I think it will affect the British economy, economic outlook and business here in potentially 4 ways. The first is clearly whether there is some form of membership of the single market, in particular for financial institutions, whether they retain passporting rights or, as a fallback position, some enhanced form of equivalence. Ancillary to that is, what about trading relationships with non-member states? That can't really be determined, it seems to me, until you know what the trading relationship with the European Union is going to be, whether it's in or out of the customs union, for example. Secondly, that first point, I think, will determine how successful the UK continues to be in attracting foreign direct investment. It is very successful at present, particularly from the US, for example. Most US firms operating in Europe are headquartered here. Thirdly, the third point is the free movement issue. One of the things that has driven growth in the United Kingdom is the fact that it has had access to a highly skilled, highly motivated, readily available workforce from the other member states. Will that continue or not? What was the referendum about? Was it about sovereignty? Was it about immigration? Different people say different things. And the final point is the point that I would echo from the previous speaker, which is, depending upon the nature of the relationship with the European Union, the UK will have much greater flexibility to determine its own regulation in some areas, and that may present opportunities for business.
Thank you very much. Andy.
Oh, well, thanks for having me. I think I'm here partly because I'm a lawyer in Dechert and I'm working with clients and companies who are trying to figure out what's going on, and it's not an easy task. Partly, I think, because, although it wasn't my fault, I was in number 10 at the time with David Cameron.
This is climate environment, right?
Yeah.
Which is totally different than the story.
Matt Phillips, you do. Okay.
All right.
One, two, three, four, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
Could you move a little bit to your left? Yeah. Split the difference. Right there, okay.
but everyone has a right to have those views heard and have that voice made clear. So there is a lot of uncertainty, but how do you start to try and build some of the certainty around it? Well, firstly, I very much agree. Before you do anything, there are two things that need to be in place. One is, what does our relationship with the WTO look like? So we talk of that as a baseline to all of these trading relationships. What does that actually look like? We've had some sort of some indication from Liam Fox he doesn't want to do a great deal different from the schedules that we have currently with the EU. That, to some extent, has to be agreed by the other partners and, of course, with the EU itself. There's some indication around how he'll deal with developed or least developed countries that may impact on those who are responsible for, or with a big focus in trade in goods. And with the Caribbean, for example, if you're an importer of sugar, it could have a big impact on your business from doing nothing. So getting the WTO relationship is going to be one of the core building blocks. And the other one, absolutely, of course, is the UK-EU relationship. And I very much agree with Jacqueline there. I also agree with the comments that Phil made. This is going to happen. That's the main thing I would take away. Because there is this sort of constant, I do hear the odd refrain, less and less so from people I speak to in Brussels now, but still at most events I go to, someone says, but really? Really? And my answer is really. Because I just cannot conceive of a way. I mean, there are nuances in which you might have a general election at some point, other things may happen, but I just cannot conceive a way, especially where the Labour Party is, especially with this Prime Minister, that we're going to move away from the position that we will leave the EU. But then the question is, the fundamental point is, what does the UK's relationship with the EU and the trading relationship look like? And again, not huge amounts of certainty there, but we had a statement from the Prime Minister at the conference. It's not about Norway, this is not Switzerland. So clearly some indication that we are not looking at free movement, and therefore I think not looking at the single market membership. That in itself, I think, would be a big political totemic issue. But there might be a way the EU could have found a way through. We don't have an entire single market in services, for example. There might be ways we could have fudged that point slightly. But to say we're not going to be part of the European Court of Justice jurisdiction, which is this thing that binds together the European Union law and makes sure it moves together forward as a whole, I think that it's not much talked about, but is a crucial basis upon which we're going to really see a different world we're going to be in. And that means we're in a free trade agreement world. And that means, it seems to me, that the Prime Minister's speech to conference was a starting gun for sector against sector interests. What does the Prime Minister, what does the UK deal look like? What does the framework of that deal look like? And what do the specific interests they want to protect look like going forward? And that, to me, I think the party conference was the starting gun for those discussions. As I say, the motor industry is having a strong voice, and Nissan is getting through the front door because there are key big investment projects that all companies are making now, but some of them are slightly more totemic than others, obviously. So for political reasons, that has to be managed, if I put it as diplomatically as I can. So we start to see some certainty, and they try to provide a bit more certainty by talking about grandfathering, that don't worry, on Brexit Day, B-Day, we're going to have all the EU laws that exist now, we're going to transfer them into the UK law, so you can continue to plan your business on that basis. That's great until B-Day +1. And the big question is, what will they do then? We don't know, is the answer. And that's a part of the negotiation they'll need to have with the EU. If you want passporting rights or equivalence, all that stuff, you need to understand how those two sets of laws that the EU and UK will move together. Those are going to be the fundamental building blocks, I think, of the trade going forward, both the WTO, the UK-EU deal, and really, what does this start to look like? And I think there's some still big questions out there for the government to answer.
Great, thank you. Thanks very much. So, where do we start with all of that? Andrew, thank you very much for running through that, Jacqueline, and thanks too. Just with your previous experience, Andrew, working with David Cameron and so on, could you just tell us what he was thinking?
No.
Did you try and stop him?
Well, firstly,
probably not your job, probably an unfair question.
Before, I hadn't realised I'd be on quite the same stage. I'm obviously not worthy. But I wasn't in number 10 at the time. He made the speech and obviously made that decision. But also, if I was, I wouldn't tell you what I said or thought. But he would have received all the advice from officials around the consequences and impact. And I can be very assured, having been in the European Secretariat, the Cabinet Office at the time, that that advice was very thorough. It's then a big political decision for him, for George Osborne, and for the Conservative Party to make. So what was he thinking? I honestly don't know. But also, I mean, you have to remember, they did stand for election on this platform, and they were elected by the British people on this platform. So it's very easy to say, to be pretty glib about this, but actually there are difficult issues out there, and that was a political choice they made. It was one that I think he talked about for some time in a leadership election back in 2005, and that's how he thought he needed to deliver it. I would bet my bottom dollar that there was conflicting advice from close advisors at the time.
Jacqueline, I think many people, after the referendum result, on the Leave side of the argument, you can probably name a few of them yourselves, said that this means essentially the EU is, as a project, finished. Is it?
No.
What sort of an emotional state is the European Union in? I mean, how hard are they taking it, and how will that affect the negotiations that are going on?
So the immediate reaction, and I was in Brussels quite shortly afterwards, was probably the shock, which is similar to today's shock about a surprise that was largely unpredicted. There was a lot, initially, it seemed to me, of anger as well. And I think it's fair to say that a number of individuals, but also collectively, member states, feel that this was something that was unnecessary. Now, in British political terms, that may be a different equation, but it distracted the European Union from dealing with some very central problems, the problems of economic and monetary union, the refugee problem, how to get back to its central task, as David Cameron put it, of generating prosperity. And I think what you see in Bratislava, and going forward now, they're going to meet again in December, and I think in February in Malta, the 27 are still determined not to be deflected by the negotiations on Brexit from those, what they see as their core priorities. And maybe they've added a few to that in terms of defence cooperation, for example.
Now, I've just come back from a trade trip with the Prime Minister to India, which was her first trade mission and the first trip that she's made on a bilateral basis outside of the EU since taking over. And she's obviously trying to lay the groundwork for a deal outside of Europe, a free trade deal with India at some point after we leave the EU. But she found it very difficult to make huge amounts of progress at this point. There was quite a public row between Theresa May and Narendra Modi over essentially migration, the same kind of issues, the same equation of free trade against migration and control of the borders that cropped up in those talks, as indeed they are cropping up in the talks that we are going to embark upon with the European Union. So I suppose I'm just wondering, I mean, we just talked about emotions in terms of the European Union's response, but the issue politically in this country that is most emotive, as far as I can tell, is cracking down on migration. That seems to be the one red line that everyone has agreed on in government that cannot be negotiated away in these Brexit talks. How can you stick to that as a negotiator while also obtaining the kind of access to the single market that you need in order to succeed in trade? Is that even going to be possible?
It's certainly not going to be easy. It doesn't surprise me that that was the approach of the Indian government. The EU is negotiating a free trade agreement with the Indian government, and I think it's no secret that one of the stumbling blocks in that negotiation was visa facilitation, and in particular, the UK as a member state's refusal to relax visas to the European visa rules for the European Union. So it's really just replicating the same discussion. I think the Union, in its different component parts, felt that it had gone a long way towards meeting the UK's concerns in February. And it's interesting that the February resettlement deal just evaporated overnight in the campaign. A negotiation is a negotiation. Both parties start with, well, we hope that by the time it starts, both parties will have well understood and clearly defined objectives. And both sides will have mutually incompatible objectives. So if a deal is to be done, they need to move towards the middle.
Is there any appetite in Europe? Is there any appetite in Europe for a compromise on the issue of migration, given that that is also one of the bigger issues that the EU faces more generally?
I think that the attitude of the other 27 to free movement of persons is fundamentally different from that in the United Kingdom. So there are concerns about the way it pans out in practice with things like access to social welfare benefits, and concerns about security and the ability to remove people from your territory. But unlike the UK, I don't think there's a fundamental challenge at present in the governments. Obviously, if Marine Le Pen was elected, that might change. But in the current configuration, there isn't that fundamental challenge.
I also think if they were going to move, February was the time to do it, not now. So you're not going to get anything approaching your February deal. And I wonder how many people here have read the February deal and remember anything about it. But
that's interesting, because there was another school of thought, which was that unless you actually do vote to leave and play hardball, you'll never get anything out of the EU. That was a strong
that was a
argument.
Boris school of thought. I mean,
he's Foreign Secretary.
He is Foreign Secretary, yes.
You're a great diplomat.
Pregnant pause. Yes.
I mean, what I find fundamentally difficult about the whole migration debate, because I think you're right, it is a pretty poisonous debate, and it's clearly a big either systemic issue, clearly a big political issue, but actually it's just, this to me is the highlight of just how poorly argued the entire discussion around the referendum and the EU membership was. With all due respect, I spent 3 years in Brussels. It's a nightmare sometimes. There are many things that are wrong with it, both created by member states, by the Parliament, and by the Commission. Everyone is at fault. And there's lots of stuff that could be done to change it, frankly. And I think there's a missed opportunity. I think it may end up integrating further, and it comes to a point where you either go much further or you're managing this rather unsatisfactory position. The EU is pretty good at managing unsatisfactory positions, but I think without the UK, which is really quite a force of slowing down lots of different things, which I don't think people appreciate until we'll leave, or understand until we leave. Many people didn't appreciate it at all when I was there. But there are lots of problems with the EU that we just didn't get a chance to discuss and get to grips with. We won't have a chance to change them now ourselves. That's for others to do. But it does worry me and sadden me slightly that actually you're right, I think, in terms of the discussion of migration and of access to the market for different people as being one of the systemic big political issues. This Prime Minister has the advantage of not having such a difficult Home Secretary as her predecessor, but it will remain nonetheless a huge political thorn in her side going forward, and a way in which she manages it, I'm sure, will be very much under her control, and it will be her decisions to make.
Just turning for a second away from the trade and labour equation, what about where we stand or will stand in terms of regulations that apply, and how much of that red tape it's actually going to be feasible for Britain to dispense with? Because you'll remember clearly from the campaign, cutting red tape was a great refrain of the leavers as to why we should all vote to leave the EU. But I was talking to one of the ministers in the Trade Department a couple of weeks ago, and this we put out on the Bloomberg, and he was saying that actually when it comes to securing the ability of our financial services to operate passporting or equivalents, we may actually find ourselves in this country forced to accept all of the EU's regulations as they are drawn up, but we just won't be in the room deciding them. Now, that doesn't sound to me like taking back control.
No, it's not. But it's.
But what are the alternatives? What would your advice be?
Well, part of the question is, what do you want that relationship to look like, and what really matters to you, and both financially and politically. I mean, the passporting, the city, the equivalent issues are huge of course, and they're a big focus for this government and for the negotiations. As I said, this is about the undertaking to grandfather, to bring all the existing EU law into UK law, with some tweaking and all the other bits and pieces that need to happen on day one, provide some certainty to business. But the big question then is, what will you do in B-Day +1? Will you follow those laws that are made in order to reassure the Commission and others who will be responsible for deciding whether the UK system is suitably equivalent to be able to enjoy all the benefits that brings or not? Now, there may be different ways of doing it, and you might find some nuances that will allow you both to remain in that EU regime but have a sort of UK bespoke arrangement or position that will be more beneficial to businesses here. That's certainly possible, but you're really around the margins on these occasions. And similarly, take one example of recognition of judgments. If we decided to take in EU law on recognition of judgments, that means that on B-Day +1, UK courts will recognise the judgments given in Germany. But doesn't mean that the German courts will recognise UK judgments unless the EU agrees to do that. So there is a lot of stuff. Once you start picking away at any of this, it gets very complicated very quickly. And so the big question is, what does that end up looking like? And until you know what that future relationship is, what are you doing now to provide certainty to business to say, this is where we'll be going? If we're transitioning, this is what the bridge looks like. I fear at the moment it's going to look more like a pier. And that's the problem. And it's about getting that certainty now, because if they don't, by the time they get to announcing Brexit Day, all the businesses will be elsewhere, whether it's New York or Frankfurt.
Yes, I was going to make the same point. The difficulty, I think, for business is that the uncertainty persists until the agreement has been reached. And the 2 years that everybody talks about are for the withdrawal agreement. They're not necessarily the time it will take to negotiate the future relationship. So increasingly you hear actually about 3 phases, up to the point of withdrawal, some kind of interim arrangement, and then the final relationship, which is a theoretical framework, but it still has to be agreed. Second, I hear in the city that people would like the assurance on day one after notification that they will have the protection of those interim arrangements. Now, it seems to me if you're sitting on the other side of the negotiating table, why would you offer that assurance to the UK? And the final point I would make, which Andrew touched upon, is the focus of discussion is often on the trading relationship, but actually there are lots of other things that need sorting out, including justice and home affairs and security links and cooperation on foreign policy and research and so on and so forth. And are we going to have a single overarching agreement where nothing is agreed until everything is agreed, or are we going to try and hive off some of these separate issues? And that just adds to the overall complexity. Of course, it's going to be possible for goods manufacturers to trade into the single market because they have the rules the same way the Chinese or the Americans do. But I think it will be difficult for the UK to become a standard taker rather than a standard maker.
Thank you very much. We are basically out of time, but I want to take a couple of quick questions. Anybody have any burning desire? Yep, go for it, sir. Do shout. Keep it quick.
Stephen from Accenture Strategy. Seems the media has echoed lots of concern from UK-based financial services on the loose of passporting. How about the 8,000 EU financial firms that use the same passporting access to enter the UK? Any thoughts from EU, Jackie?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the argument of London, the city, is London is Europe's financial centre, and it serves the real economy throughout the European Union, not just in London. So all 27 member states have an interest in preserving London, the city, as a financial hub. And should they not do that, the risk is people will move to Singapore or to New York or wherever it may be. I've heard that argument run, and I've also heard people push back against it, saying that sounds remarkably to us like Project Fear. You don't give us what we want, things will go badly for you. So there is some pushback. But again, this is part of the dynamic of a negotiation, and a question of who favours what. I think John Cunliffe, the Deputy Governor of the Bank, said last week, when it comes to setting the UK's negotiating objectives, who has the most political and social capital? Is it the car manufacturers or is it the banks in the city? And the answer he gave was the financial institutions need to rebuild their social capital badly.
Last question. Yep. Just there's a microphone coming. Thanks.
Thank you. Uta Prout from Moody's. Question to Jacqueline. I've heard the arguments about the referendum will not be reversed, but there has been a discussion in the last weeks about possibly for the UK to negotiate a deal, and then if there is a view that the deal isn't suitable, then possibly still withdrawing. And there was the argument that Article 50 isn't clear as to whether or not you might be able to withdraw. So the question as to whether there is view from the European institutions on that possibility.
In 30 words or less.
The revocability of Article 50. Well, the British government and Donald Tusk disagree upon this. The British government, it's a plank of the government case in the Miller application that Article 50 is irrevocable. Once you put down notice, you can't withdraw it. Other people think differently. Article 50 doesn't give you an answer. My answer, my personal answer is this is a case where law would defer to politics. So if the other 27 felt the UK had changed its mind, which I think is not going to happen, but if they felt it had seriously changed its mind, then a way would be found.
I agree with you. I'm just curious if the Supreme Court will refer it to the European Court of Justice for a 2-year decision.
What a delicious prospect.
Yeah.
Thank you both very much indeed for coming to join us. We are out of time. Ladies and gentlemen, Andrew Hood and Jacqueline Miner.
Thank you.